Perfection gets a lot of folks in trouble, right? It's just not what we should be aiming for. We should be excellence, yes. Perfection, no.
I'm Jeremy Hobson, and this is The Follow-Up, our weekly podcast you can only get here on the Middle podcast feed. And a reminder that your donations are a big reason the Middle exists. Right now, they're being matched dollar for dollar at listentothemiddle.com. So today, we are following up on our show about failure and how you come back from it. It is something everyone experiences in their lives. And there are people who think about this kind of thing all the time and are experts in how we can make the most of any situation. And one of them is our guest right now. That would be Nina Bowman, executive coach and co-founder and managing partner of the Mariswood Group. Full disclosure, the one time in my life that I had an executive coach, it was Nina Bowman. So Nina, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's nice to be here.
Well, right off the bat, I will say that I started in public radio at a very young age. I rose up the ranks very quickly. I was the youngest national host ever. And as I grew as a journalist and a broadcaster, no one ever taught me the things about how to manage, how to mentor people, which are, of course, very important in any job as you rise up the ranks.
That's true for many people, right? We kind of learn as we go along. And that's not a bad way to learn as long as we are open to reflecting on what worked and what didn't.
Where we succeeded and where we failed, which would set us up perfectly for this.
You got it.
So, and I imagine that in your career as an executive coach, you've had to deal with people who fail at things all the time. Is there one message overall that you like to impart in that case, or is it a case-by-case basis?
So, a lot of times I'm working with folks who are successful and are wanting to be even more successful. And yes, there are times when I'm working with folks who have failed and are trying to find their way through it. And I think the message that I give them is let's not even call it failure. Let's call it learning, right? Because I think when we view it as failure, the lens at which we're approaching it is not a helpful lens. It doesn't help us grow, and many times it makes us stuck. So the first thing is to just view it as a learning process.
Do you find that people, though, before you get to that point, don't look at it like that? That they see it as something that they should wallow in, and that they're not thinking of could be an opportunity?
Absolutely. And let's be honest, when, in our lives, when we have made a big mistake, something that we may perceive as a failure, it's not just the mistake that you made. It comes with a whole emotional process, right? That requires grieving and sort of getting past the emotional piece. And so I think the first thing is view it as an emotional process and allow yourself to go through it. Right? If you just try to ignore the feelings, you're not going to grow in the way that you need to either. So don't skip over. Give yourself some time to grieve. Give yourself some time to feel. But then observe your language. Observe your language in the process, right? If the language in your head is, I'm a screw up, versus I made a mistake. I didn't do X, Y, Z. There's a big difference between how you take those two messages in. And when it's, I'm a failure, then you walk through that process in an entirely different way that isn't constructive. So again, one leans towards seeing it as a learning process, and one is seeing it as an identity issue.
So that gets us perfectly to one of the calls that we got from one of our listeners. Listen to this.
This is Teresa from St. Louis. On the topic of failure, what I learned is that I am not my mistake. I have to take responsibility for my mistakes sometimes, but the mistake itself is not who I am. And when I get back to who I am, I can move on.
Nina, this is something that came up on the show. Not every failure is your fault. Sometimes it's about outside circumstances. Sometimes you did everything you could to save your marriage, but it still failed. What do you think about that?
So, one, I love the point that the listener got to, right? In the sense that it is not her, that there are these, there are these other pieces. But it's important that we break down what happened, right? Because sometimes it is something that we did. Sometimes it is something outside of our control, and we have to do the process, go through the post-mortem of what was what, so that we can actually learn from it. What's really interesting is when we make mistakes, we often like to attribute it to all these outside forces. When we do something right, we like to attribute it to ourselves. That's human nature. But if we understand that and fight up against that kind of cognitive bias, we can actually learn from what happened and say, all right, maybe I didn't take in the context of what was happening here. I could have done this differently. And then we start to realize that, yep, we played a role. And next time we're going to do it differently. And that's where those mistakes help to actually make us better in how we show up next time, whether it's a marriage or whether it's something professionally.
All right, let's listen to another caller.
Rhapsody Neyland, Clearwater, Florida. Well, in my life, I've had to come back from failure many times. Some things I had my own agency over, and some things I did not. But each time I used God as my savior to bring me through the challenge. Because I come from domestic violence background, had domestic violence relationship with my last husband, but I have two beautiful children who are now 17 and 19. We've been chronically homeless since that situation. But you know what? I'm facing that again right now, but I know that God will find a way to help me move forward.
Nina, what we hear there, I think, is resilience, optimism,
Yes,
despite
that's
very
right.
difficult circumstances.
That's right. And that optimism helps us to see our way through. It helps us to see different pathways, when we get stuck in the negativity aspect of it, right? It's never going to work out well. This is always what happens. And we kind of catastrophize the situation. We actually get stuck in the whole process. And so what I love about what that sort of listener was sharing is sort of maintaining hope through that, which gives us resilience to kind of keep pressing and again seeing new avenues for how we can improve. And sometimes it takes some time.
What do you think keeps people trying and trying despite failure?
I think it's that positivity. I think it is a mindset that, I can always get better. And that's the mindset that we want. Life isn't meant to be lived, in perfection. We're always tested along the way. Our morals are tested, and we have to step back and assess, why did we make the decisions that we made? And what can we do differently next time? And when we enter that personal discussion with a sense of positivity and a mindset of always getting better, then each time we do get better. And that's actually the recommended path. Like, don't look for the big steps. Like, look for the small steps that you can take to sort of move towards repair or move towards doing something different next time, right? Our brain likes that better. It likes when we do small things versus really big things.
Yeah. What do you tell people when they want to give up?
You help them to sort of look at, well, what's the real cost in this, right? We have a way of sort of making the cost bigger than it is, right? My life will never be good. I'll never be able to recover that relationship. I'm never going to be able to work with that person again. The question is that just what you think, or is that reality? And we should test what you think that reality is, because many times there's more space to fix things than we originally, perceived there is. So make small steps. Think about how you can go about it in small chunks.
All right, we'll stand by because we've got more coming up on the follow-up with Nina Bowman. We'll be right back.
With Uber's new women preferences, women riders can request a woman driver whenever they want. Like Amy, who's traveling solo in a city she's never been to before. Or Danielle, who works night shifts at the hospital. Or Kelly and Jana, who were way overdue for a night out. Because sometimes comfort comes from having another woman with you. Request women drivers with women preferences on Uber. Learn more on the Uber app.
Welcome back to the follow-up. I'm Jeremy Hobson. I'm joined by Nina Bowman, executive coach and managing director at the Mariswood Group. Nina, do you think that our attitude about failure and how to come back from it has changed over time? In other words, is the younger generation viewing things differently than the older generation?
Oh, goodness. That's a great question. I do think the younger generation is willing to test and try more, right?
Huh.
I think sometimes they're willing to, well, one, they've experienced a lot in their early lives, a world that's just constantly changing, adapting. So I think that helps. But there are probably two sides of the coin on that. There are some people who will say, some of them, depending on, their time frame, maybe, haven't seen a whole lot of change or came in with expectations of their parents and their parents' lives. And so, they're not as flexible. So I think we see both, but there are definitely those who are just willing to try different things, and they get frustrated by folks who are kind of a different era who might want to do things the same way. And we see that in the workforce all the time. Those who want to make change and move faster and do things differently, which means making mistakes and trying something new and piloting things faster. And there are folks who, sometimes aren't ready for that.
But you think that there's a little more risk with the younger generation?
I think so. I think they're more risk-taking for sure. For sure,
All right, well, let's get to another voicemail that came in.
Hi, my name is Keith Smith. I am a model who recently just had kidney failure and had to learn how to come back, not just from a psychological standpoint, but a literal physical standpoint on failure, and some tips on how to overcome what you think is there and it's not there anymore.
So he says he had to deal with kidney failure. There are so many people who deal with health issues. Many of them may view those as personal failures, even if it's not their fault. What do you say to somebody like that?
Again, I want to talk with them about their coping mechanism, right? When we go through something like that we feel, sometimes we may feel it's outside of our control. Sometimes we may feel like we contributed to it for some reason, right? Maybe we had addiction or something like that, and it led to some kind of medical failure, in which case people may really personalize that, or they may say, no, I didn't have anything to do with it. So, we really have to think about, how are we coping? Do we have healthy coping mechanisms? Those that lean more towards sort of resilience coping, or those that, lead towards numbing, right? Sort of the destructive coping mechanisms. And so it's important to really, to sort of assess those mechanisms with the individual to make sure we're moving on a healthy path. Again, hope is important in those scenarios. Sometimes, right, there's a reality that we may not be able to change what's happening to us. And so therefore then we move towards a different discussion, right? How do we just appreciate the now? And what's good about the now, this moment that we can appreciate, and how do we learn to live in it? And when we do that, then we can sort of get out of our own heads about what little time we have left, and how do we just get to appreciating what is there for us in front of us.
It also brings up something that came up from our callers in our show, which is the idea that nobody's perfect, although many people strive for perfection. But that does get to this idea of failure and sort of understanding that, okay, if I'm not perfect, then maybe I am willing to take that risk and fail because I don't have a perfect record to maintain anyway. We can take some dings.
Yeah. Well, first, perfection gets a lot of folks in trouble. Right? It's just not what we should be aiming for. We should be excellence, yes. Perfection, no. Because, it's like sort of whose concept of perfection, right? Your idea of perfection is different than someone else's. And so, you've got to make sure there's alignment. And it holds that bar so ridiculously high and often not realistic. and it can be destructive to the relationships around us. And we may not even realize how it can be destructive. It can be destructive to how we manage our time, because over time, seeking perfection can burn us out. Instead of recognizing that there are other ways of doing things in a more constructive manner in terms of how we're using our time. So, I say beware of perfection. It shouldn't be necessarily what we should seek.
All right, so I said on the show that the topic of failure made me think of people who learn how to do tricks on like skis or skateboards, because I can't imagine the amount of times that they fail and how much it has got to hurt when they do. Which brings me to our final voicemail. Listen to this.
Hi, this is Joey from Durham, North Carolina. In regards to failure, I had found myself failing at a series of jobs. When I was unemployed, I discovered skateboarding at the age of 33, which I found was just failing and failing and failing over again until you achieve the desired result. And now at 37, I'm obsessed. I love it. And I'm discovering how to apply that to other aspects of my life. And it's been great for me. And it's really changed my perspective on things.
What do you think of that, Nina Bowman? And have you ever advised anybody to take up skateboarding to get better at resilience and failing?
I love that. I absolutely love that. And the reason why is because it's experimentation, just trying new things. We don't realize how stuck we get in our routines, and how just exploring something new. It helps to build new perspectives, seeing new kind of pathways to things, and we can't make the link unless we try. So, when I'm coaching folks, sometimes it's just like, let's try all these different things. Go in a bookstore and or go online to an online bookstore and just like look at a whole bunch of different things that you wouldn't necessarily go to. Like go to the section of the bookstore that you wouldn't normally look at, and what sparks your interest in ways that you just want to say, oh, I'm interested in trying that. Mm-hmm. When we do that, when we keep that open to just try something completely new, it leads to creativity. It's how artists work. It's just like constantly going new places, exploring new things. You're looking for inspiration, and it works. It can work in our own lives. So we can take some lessons from creatives around how to find new ways in and out of things, and find new things that we enjoy. And that mindset of exploration can help us manage, the times in our lives mm-hmm. when we feel like we have made a mistake.
So a lot of times on this show, we get into political topics. And so I just want to ask you one thing about that, which is not just the Trump administration, although he is very good at not ever admitting failure about anything, but politicians generally do this. I mean, I'm thinking back to even the Biden years, like, no, the economy is really good. We did a great job. What do you think about people and our politicians who don't ever want to admit failure? Companies probably too, because they don't want to be sued over whatever they did wrong. But what about people who just don't ever want to admit it?
I think there's a cost to it. You might get over the hump once, but people understand when they're not being told the real thing many times, right? Bark cults where, you're sort of in your own bubble and there's no other information coming in, but it affects authenticity. And I think there's a cost that comes to that. And we have to appreciate that there's a cost. And at some point, the bill needs to be paid.
So you would advise like a CEO, if they made a big mistake and they failed at something that everybody could see, to actually admit it to their team and say, look, we did wrong here. This is how we're going to learn from this mistake.
So, there's a lot of ways to nuance that. But yes, vulnerability and honesty helps the company grow. They're trying to manage markets too. And so they've got to massage how that message gets out. So it's, when they give it, I would advise them saying, we learned from this and here's what we're doing now that's going to make it work. Right. So that's the message that you want to bring. So it's balance the mistake that they think they made with how, what's the strategy for moving forward that that people know is going to be believable and is an honest representation of what's happening.
So every single guest that has come on this show gets to make a prediction about anything. It can be anything. We've heard sports predictions. We've heard political predictions. I mean, maybe from your world, it's something that's going on in the business world right now. Do you have a prediction for us, Nina, about anything?
Oh gosh. I don't know if it's a prediction, but with all of the change that we're experiencing in the world from every angle, all I can say is learn the lessons from our past mistakes, because we all are going to need to live in a mode where we are constantly shifting and changing and experimenting to get through it. And we need to appreciate sort of what the mindset of being a child again, because we are going to be challenged in every way, shape, and form over the next few months and years. So we've got to get with the program of what it means to embrace constant change so we can get through it.
That's a good prediction. Nina Bowman, executive coach and co-founder of the Mariswood Group. Nina, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Jeremy. Pleasure to be here on The Middle.
And thanks to you for listening. It was produced by Harrison Patino. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Substack. It's listentothemiddle.substack.com. I'm Jeremy Hobson, and I'll talk to you soon.